Chapter 10, LFG. The afternoon's Quidditch game brought an opportunity to ask the twins why they wanted to join the Marauders. It wasn't really Quidditch, since there were only 4 players, and they had to use apples off of the trees, rather than a quaffle just in case someone threw too hard, and it landed in a muggle's yard. Mostly, it was an opportunity for the Weasley boys to each have a turn on Harry's Nimbus 2000 broom, while the other 3 tried to throw apples into a bucket past them. But it counted a couple of XP toward Harry's flying skill, so it wasn't nothing. During a lull in the game, Harry brought up, "So, what do you two know about the Marauders?" Fred and George shared a look, and then Fred asked, "What do you know about the Marauders?" Harry shrugged and explained that they were a group of 4 guys, that you two want to be members. Oh, and that one of them was my dad, James Potter. Simultaneous gasps from the twins preceded George saying, "Merlin, really? That's awesome." Fred agreed. "We have to show you the map." George smirked. "Let's see what it has to say." Fred rushed off back to their room while George moved them all a little farther away from the house and any chance of a parent or sibling overhearing. A few minutes later, Fred returned with a piece of old parchment and folded it open. He announced, "Marauders, we would like to introduce you to Harry Potter, son of James Potter." Handwriting appeared on the parchment, saying, "Mr. Prongs is excited to meet young Harry and asks, who is his mother? Mr. Mooney thinks Mr. Prongs knows the answer he wants. Lily, Evans." Harry remembered his mother's maiden name. "Mr. Prongs needs a moment. Mr. Padfoot knew it was inevitable. Mr. Wormtail wasn't so sure. Mr. Mooney suggests that MSSRS. Weasley show the heir of the Marauders the other functions of the map, while Mr. Prongs is unresponsive in glee. "Well, that pretty much proves it," Fred said, astonished. "Prongs must be Harry's dad. Who are the other ones?" George asked. Harry opened the guild panel and listed off Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew. Mr. Mooney suggests MSSRS. Weasley stopped digging for more information and asked the real Marauders if they want more information now that they have those names. "Fine," Fred grumbled. George tapped the parchment with his wand and said, "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good." "You say Mischief managed to turn it back off," Fred explained quietly. The writing on the page evaporated and was replaced by an announcement that the various code names presented the Marauders map, which then gave way to a line art drawing that Harry quickly realized was Hogwarts. As they further folded out the parchment, they could see what seemed to be every floor of the school, with all rooms and corridors fully mapped. And there were a few dots on the maps, labeled with the names of the professors that stayed in the castle over the summer. Albus Dumbledore was in his office. Minerva McGonagall and Phileas Flitwick were in their classrooms. Argus Filch was roaming the halls, and Rubeus Hagrid was wandering the grounds just outside. "It also shows secret passages and their password once you get close enough," Fred explained. "It gets a little busy when everyone's in the castle," George added, "but dead useful for making sure a professor or prefect won't catch us when we're out after curfew." Harry grinned and inspected the map. The Marauders map. This map, when unlocked, displays Hogwarts and its secrets. If equipped, it grants you the Marauder perk. "I knew it," Harry said. "Can I hold this? I want to check something." Fred and George nodded, watching in curiosity as Harry folded the map up and put it in his pocket, confirming on his inventory screen that it appeared as equipped in one of his miscellaneous body slots. He brought up his floating map and sighed. "Brilliant." "What?" Ron checked. "I can see where everyone is here too," Harry explained. "Your mum's in the kitchen, Percy and Ginny are in their bedrooms, and your dad's in the shed." "That's an easy enough guess," Fred said, unsure if they were being tricked. George continued, "If you're somehow using the map for our house and not just Hogwarts, tell us something you couldn't guess." "Okay." Harry looked around and noticed a strange X marked on the far side of the garden. "I think there's something interesting over on that side of the garden," he pointed. "That's just the old tool shed," Ron shrugged. "But we can check it out." The 4 boys wandered over to the place Harry had indicated. Sure enough, it was a truly decrepit wooden shed, probably built over a century earlier. There were a few rusty gardening tools in there, but it was clear the Weasleys barely used it for storage due to the gaps in the boards and how it could fall over at any moment. As they got closer, a note appeared next to the X that said, "Hidden trapdoor to the Gnome King's lair." "There's a trapdoor around here, I think," Harry said. "Says it's for the Gnome King's lair." We have wondered where the gnomes keep coming from, Fred admitted. George explained. We have to dig gnome the garden a few times every summer. Okay, Harry, say we believe you, Fred started. George finished. What is going on? Harry and Ron shared a look, and Ron nodded, so Harry stood back and said, First off, I accept your request to join the Marauders. Fred Weasley has joined the Marauders. George Weasley has joined the Marauders. Thanks. Fred said, not having detected anything different. Do you want to join, Ron? Harry asked. Sure, Ron agreed. Ron Weasley has joined the Marauders. Sure enough, all three names now appeared on the active tab of the Marauders Guild, and there were no more names on the request list. Okay, so on my birthday, something weird happened. Well, weirder than normal, Harry began. After explaining it to Ron, he basically had it down, and it only took about 10 minutes to sum everything up. He had to prove he could tell Fred and George apart and demonstrate taking items in and out of his inventory before they completely believed him. But when they did, the opportunities are, Fred boggled. George nodded in amazement. Practically limitless, right? How do we get access to this? Fred checked. Harry shrugged. We haven't figured it out yet. Hermione and Ron want it too. Ron nodded. He'd been thinking about it for the whole explanation and said, We should check out this Gnome King's lair. Gnome King's lair dungeon quest. Defeat the Gnome King and steal his treasure. Quest log agrees. Harry nodded, as that appeared with Ron's suggestion. It says it's a dungeon. He realized they didn't really have any context for that other than the Hogwarts dungeons, and explained, in video games, a dungeon is what they call underground places where you fight a lot of monsters. I guess I should add you two to the party if we're going. Your charisma is not high enough, party limit 3-0, Harry said, narrating. It says my charisma is too low to have more than 3 people in my party, and we still have Hermione. Harry worried it suddenly made a lot more sense why he didn't have any close friends at school other than Ron and Hermione. I just raised my charisma, Ron said. Can you make me the leader? Make Ron party leader, Harry said. Ron Weasley is now party leader. A little crown icon appeared next to his name to the left of Harry's vision, and it moved above Hermione's. That did it, he explained. Fred and George want to join the party, Ron asked. Sure, they said, simultaneously, mystified at this whole situation where nothing much seemed to be happening other than their brother and his friends speaking very specifically about having a party. Fred and George appeared at the bottom of the party list. They overlapped a lot more closely than Ron and Hermione and seemed to basically share their meters. I think they only count as one party member, Harry explained, but we're good. Then let's find the trapdoor. Everyone got your wands, Ron checked. But we're underage, Fred reminded them. Oh, we didn't explain instances, Harry remembered. Enter instance. The world more than a few feet away from the shed went blurry, and Fred and George really started to believe. We can use magic in here without anyone noticing. George just said, Harry, if Ginny doesn't marry you, one of us might. Harry blushed and asked, Ginny, what? Wants to marry you, Ron grumbled. I thought I mentioned that. That's why she was so weird at lunch. Anyway, I think I found the trap door. Wingardium Leviosa. He managed to levitate an old, soul-covered door open, revealing a short ladder down into the dirt and darkness. The 4 boys gingerly descended, Harry lighting his wand so they could see into the underground warren. Despite the gnomes only being a foot tall, the ceiling was 6 feet high, and the walls a similar distance apart. It was a little close for comfort, especially after Ron's sudden growth, and with the twins being 2 years older, but could have been far smaller. The walls were old stone, and Ron suggested, maybe this used to be an old cellar that everyone forgot. Everyone else shrugged. That seemed a better explanation than Harry's new magic power placing a whole dungeon on their land that they'd never noticed before. They'd only gone down a short corridor to a turn when the gnomes started to pop out from the loose soil of the ground. Little and brown, to Harry they looked like giant potatoes with legs and a mouth full of sharp teeth. Each of them displayed, Worker Gnome, Level 1, Agagagag. They yodeled, charging toward the boys. Glacius. Fred and George incanted, binding 2 of the gnomes in ice and making the floor slippery for the others. Flypendo, Ron tried, knocking one that had escaped the ice backwards. This is a lot easier with our wands. Petrificus totalis. Harry tried, having better luck paralyzing a gnome than he had with Dudley's gang. Careful of the rest, Fred warned. They usually keep coming once we dig gnome a few, George explained. Sure enough, their passage through the gnome lair became a running battle for territory as more gnomes were attracted by the sound of their fellows being attacked. Harry felt like it was a lot like kicking over an anthill. Conserve your spells, Harry warned, when he noticed everyone's magical stamina bars starting to decrease. Don't want to tire out. Ow, one bit me, Ron complained, having switched to trying to kick them. Harry noticed that his hit point bar had indeed dropped a small fraction. By the time they'd traveled maybe a dozen yards and dealt with at least 20 gnomes, the hallway was widening and expanding, roots punching through the brick walls. I think we're under the orchard, Harry said, quickly checking the map. The wireframe mostly showed the dungeon they were in, filling in the area ahead as they entered it, but he could see a vague, translucent impression of the area above it. Mine. A slightly deeper gnome voice announced as they entered what was probably the old cellar proper, or perhaps the basement of a house that had long before existed where the orchard currently stood. Some dirt shook out of the ceiling as a 2-foot-tall gnome, far broader than any of the others, struggled out from behind a root and landed with a thump on the floor. He had a much bigger mouth than the others and wore a crown made from an old golden bracelet. King Rugido gnome, level 4-5 more worker gnomes popped out as the gnome king charged. Harry punted one and landed a knockback jinx on the king, which barely slowed him. Ron yelled in pain as a worker managed to leap and bite his wand wrist, and then in outrage as his wand snapped when he tried to smash the gnome into the wall. Fred and George were too winded for any more real battle spells, but tied up a few gnomes with the dancing feet and tickling jinxes. We have to do something about the king, Harry insisted, as the sprightly yet heavy-set potato ran about, biting at their ankles and yet moving along before anyone could kick him in the melee. Ron, tackle him. Right, Ron agreed. Fred, be a beater. Fred, who was struggling with a gnome in his hand at the moment, nodded and managed to fling the gnome like a stone at the king, knocking him into the wall where Ron pounced. You owe me a wand, Ron yelled, smacking the king's head against the wall until he stopped struggling. Everyone had a number of gnome bites and bruises, and Harry could see that all of them were down to around half hit points and nearly out of magical stamina, but there was no more movement among the gnomes. Good job, team, Harry panted, also breathing hard. The twins used their feet to shove the gnomes into a pile near the door and then started searching. I wonder if there's a nest, George wondered. I wonder if there's old wine, Fred countered. Harry was inspecting the crown on the head of the gnome king. Bracelet of resistance. This bracelet, or crown, if you're small enough, provides some resistance to magical attacks. Found out why spells barely worked on him, Harry explained. This makes you resist magic. Nice, Ron said, but then looked down at the remnants of his wand, which he'd recovered from where it had fallen. It was snapped neatly in half, the unicorn hair barely holding it together. What am I gonna do? He moaned. Get a replacement when we go to the alley, Harry suggested. With what money? Ron checked, already winding up his argument about not letting Harry pay for one. With this money, George announced, having finally dumped the contents of the king's nest out from behind the root in the ceiling. The floor glittered with many sickles and nuts, and perhaps a galleon or two. No wine, but I found what's left of a brewing kit, Fred said, pulling a decaying box out from a corner. Some of the cauldrons and rods are probably still good. Harry considered for a moment and suggested, loot split. You two keep the potions stuff, Ron keeps the money, I keep the bracelet, except I'll trade you the bracelet for the Marauders map. Fred and George had a moment of silent conference and then nodded, Fred allowing, seems more than fair, as long as we can borrow it from time to time. And you can borrow the bracelet if you need it, George concluded. Ron was beaming at the pile of dirt-encrusted money, which seemed like it would be more than enough to buy a new wand, plus maybe a bit extra. Deal, Harry agreed, tossing them the bracelet. Now, Fred ordered, let's get these boys loaded into sacks and thrown over the garden wall. George agreed. If Mum asks, we were dignaming the garden, not even a lie. Should we tell her about this cellar? Ron checked. Definitely not, Fred shook his head. You're looking at the new Marauders clubhouse. George beamed. Harry checked to make sure that none of the rest of the Weasleys were nearby before they popped out into the shed, sacks full of unconscious gnomes shoved up behind them. As soon as Harry was out, the quest to defeat the Gnome King finished. Quest complete 100 XP, earn quest reward. Old Seller 125 Combat XP earned Martial Arts XP, earned Owl Combat Magic XP, earned Owl Charms XP, earned... Whoa, that was a lot of XP, Harry grinned. He was still nowhere near level 3, but it was notable progress on his XP bar. And it was fun, Fred corrected. That's also important. George ordered. Now help us get these gnomes over the wall before Mum asks questions. That was accomplished without too much further hardship, and the boys trooped in to be ministered to by Marley Weasley, the bruises and bites from their adventure successfully laundered through dint of having done a hard chore unordered. That did, however, take the rest of the time before dinner, so they didn't make it back up to Ron's room until after they ate. I better feed. Oh no, Ron exclaimed as they walked into his room. Scabbers isn't in his cage. Chapter 11. Travel. By Wednesday, they still hadn't found Scabbers. Ron was certain he'd locked the rat in before they went outside to play, but he was nowhere to be found. Mrs. Weasley was of the opinion that the rat had wandered off before when he'd been Percy's pet, and had always turned back up. But she also quietly figured that he'd lived an extremely long time for a rat, and possibly wandered off to die, and a decade was a pretty good run for a free pet that had lasted through two boys' early Hogwarts years. Ron was pretty frustrated about it. His normal assumption would be to blame the twins, but they'd been with him almost the entire time, and he couldn't figure out why Fred would have let the rat out while he ran inside to get the Marauders map. Ginny had no interest in the fat old rat. All Ron could figure was that he hadn't latched the cage as securely as he thought. He was just hoping his pet turned back up soon. Over the next few days before the trip to the alley, they spent a lot of time cleaning up the new hideout. Fred and George surprisingly knew several cleaning charms for accidental messes and for deliberate messes that they could teach Harry. Everyone was pretty thrilled about the instancing ability that let them practice spells away from school, and they thought they'd at least gotten the cellar repaired and cleaned to the point it might not immediately get reinfested with gnomes, so they could use it the next summer. Ginny seemed to know something was up but hadn't called them on it yet, probably just due to her anxiety about getting near Harry. Everyone else seemed oblivious, and Harry had gotten another rank in his charm skill. The morning of the shopping trip, Harry woke to a new quest, signing bonus meet Gilderoy Lockhart. Oh, optional, get your picture in the paper. Oh, optional, say diagonally instead of Diagon Alley. Are we meeting Lockhart? Harry asked Mrs. Weasley over breakfast. I hope so. She confirmed. He's supposed to be doing a book signing. After the meal, she explained that they were going by flu rather than the car, which Harry was happy about because he could check that off of his travel types quest. When she explained that he needed to say Diagon Alley clearly, he got what his game system had been trying to tell him. Never one to pass up an optional goal, he took the flu powder, threw it in, waited for the fire to turn green, and said, diagonally. After several moments falling through a flaming void, the room he was spit out in was clearly not the leaky cauldron. It featured far more skulls and spiders, for one. He'd also come out at a weird angle and slid across the floor, nearly knocking over a display of creepy rings with miscellaneous eye motifs, and probably only saving his glasses from breaking due to his improved agility score. Some of the eyes glared balefully at him about the near miss. As the objectives to take the flu and to mispronounce his destination checked off, he decided maybe flu was not the travel method for him. Nobody seemed to notice his arrival in the barely lit shop, which seemed to be perhaps the most goth place he'd ever seen. As far as he could tell, it was a dark magic book and curio shop. He gave some real consideration to checking the shelves for skill books. It was only his experience with the dangerous books in Hogwarts' restricted section that stopped him. He did withdraw his invisibility cloak from his inventory and put it on, not sure he wanted to be discovered in such a place. Thinking maybe the game system just wanted him to know this place existed and planning to sneak out before the Weasleys went mad looking for him. He nearly collided with a man coming into the shop and had to move, invisibly, into a corner. With the man's platinum hair and smug demeanor, he'd have guessed it was Draco Malfoy's father even without the name plate, and even if Harry's school nemesis himself hadn't been just behind. Don't dawdle, Draco, Mr. Malfoy insisted. Lucius Malfoy Warlock, level 12. Death Eaters, Wizengamot, Slytherin, Draco Malfoy Mage. Level 2, Slytherin, of course, Malfoy Sr. was a Death Eater. Harry wasn't even a little surprised. He figured Warlock was also something dark, but on checking the codex, he discovered that was just a mage aristocrat hybrid that was common in wizard government. Draco was bothering his father for a present and having to be kept from putting his hands all over cursed items. Harry kind of wondered if Draco was some kind of karmic punishment on his father. And hilariously, most of what Draco was talking about was whining about Harry. He couldn't really remember the last time he'd whined about Draco. It had to have been right after the boy had done something, not after not having seen him for weeks. Mr. Malfoy, in fact, pointed out that Draco had spent all summer complaining about Harry. It is not prudent to appear less than fond of Harry Potter, not when most of our kind regard him as the hero that made the Dark Lord disappear. Ah, Mr. Borgin. Liam Borgin, Procurer, Level 15, Borgin and Burks, Hufflepuff. Harry checked the codex and found that a procurer was just a mage salesperson. He wondered whether people knew that the scary, greasy-haired old man running the cursed item shop had been a Hufflepuff, and figured this shop must be Borgin and Burks. Mr. Borgin tried hard to point out his sale items, but Malfoy said, "I'm not buying today, Mr. Borgin, but selling." At Borgin's surprise, he explained, "You have heard, of course, that the Ministry is conducting more raids. I have a few items at home that might embarrass me if the Ministry were to call." He showed the shopkeeper list on a bit of parchment he'd produced. As Borgin read over the list, he assumed that the Ministry wouldn't trouble the Malfoys, but Malfoy suggested that Mr. Weasley's Muggle Protection Act was responsible. "Can I have that?" Draco pointed at a clearly terrible withered hand on a cushion. Harry rolled his eyes. It turned out to be a hand of glory, useful to hold a candle and make light only visible to the wielder. Harry had to actually give it to Draco. If it was less creepy, he might want something like that. When Mr. Malfoy pointed out that Draco needed to get his grades up, Draco complained, "It's not my fault. The teachers all have favorites. That Hermione Granger." They nattered on about the supposed purity of wizard blood, and Harry had figured he'd had enough of paying attention to their nonsense. He quietly slipped out of the shop and into a street that was sketchy enough that he was very glad to be invisible. Dark even in a full August morning, a number of black-decked people in hoods were already loitering, or maybe still loitering. In the field of strange names, he was a little surprised to see Hagrid, and moved toward the gamekeeper, who was walking in the direction of the Weasleys and Hermione, which Harry assumed meant it was the way to actual Diagon Alley. The gigantic, hairy man had a similarly giant level and list of guilds: Rubeus Hagrid Ranger, Level 16 Order of the Phoenix, Hogwarts Staff, Gryffindor. Now Harry was really curious what the order was, and Hagrid would probably accidentally tell him. "Hey, Hagrid," Harry said, quickly unequipping the cloak into his inventory as he saw they were exiting across the street from the ice cream parlor. He vaguely remembered passing the dark alley on his first trip, but was glad to be back in a place he recognized. "Harry," Hagrid gasped. "Where'd you come from?" "Back there," Harry gestured. "Said the flu name wrong. It's okay. I had my cloak. What's the Order of the Phoenix?" Blindsided by the non sequitur, Hagrid admitted, "Dumbledore's group." "Fur-fighting Death Eaters. How do you know about Thar?" "Weasleys," Harry shrugged, noting XP going into his deception skill. "Who I should get back to. Oh, good, there they are. Thanks, Hagrid." And he rushed over to the group who'd accumulated the Grangers while he was missing, so they were convenient to find. "Harry, thank Merlin you're okay," Mrs. Weasley said. "I wound up in Borgin and Burks," Harry gestured. "Hagrid found me." "Oh, Mr. Weasley, I saw Lucius Malfoy trying to sell off some dark objects in there." "I bet he was," Mr. Weasley agreed, frowning. "I've been leading raids for cursed objects, and he probably knew we'd get to him soon enough." "Is he a Death Eater?" Harry asked. "Legally, no," he explained. "The courts found that he was under the Imperious Curse." "Definitely yes, though," George nodded, figuring that Harry must have seen the guild tag on his name. "Good to be rich," Fred added. Percy corrected, "If the Wizengamot found him innocent, though, we must treat him as such." It was clear the aspiring bureaucrat didn't even believe it. "Enough talk of dark things," Mrs. Weasley ordered. "Let's get to Gringotts." Harry looked at Ron, who nodded, remembering the plan. "Mum, after the bank, me and Harry." "Harry and I," Percy corrected. Should go with Hermione and her parents so we can catch up. And you know, because she'll want to spend all morning in the bookstore, Ron finished. Hermione looked at them suspiciously, though she did want to spend all morning in the bookstore, particularly to test Harry for skill books. But Mrs. Weasley seemed to buy it and just cautioned, remember it might be busy because of the signing. More reason to go early, Ron shrugged. Very well, if it's all right with Helen and Jean, she allowed. The Grangers nodded their agreement, also a bit suspicious about what Harry was up to. As Harry trailed to the back of the parade of 11 heading to the bank, he explained to Hermione. Ron broke his wand doing a quest. He had to clamp his hand on her shoulder to keep her from shouting and quickly assured her, but we have the money to replace it. His mum doesn't know about either. We only told Fred and George about the game. Why? She asked quietly, after suppressing her urge to chastise. You told my parents. They might bring in the ministry, or at least Dumbledore, and I still want to learn more before we talk to the teachers, Harry explained. Hermione, also burned by how little help they'd gotten with the Quirrell situation, nodded in acceptance. Plus, if the Department of Mysteries started testing Harry's abilities, she wouldn't get to. Oh, and Lockhart is going to be at the bookstore. He's written almost the whole book list, Hermione said, excited to meet an author. The trip through the bank was a whirlwind. Goblins seemed to have the same level range as humans, but their own obscure class names. Harry was a little embarrassed to see how little money was in the Weasley family vault, and rushed into his as quickly as he could, though he was sure Mrs. Weasley saw the pile of gold that he owned. What she didn't see was Harry instantly sucking a few hundred galleons into his inventory as he put his hand into the pile, physically withdrawing only the few dozen coins she suggested for his books and supplies. He figured the money was just as safe and way more accessible in his inventory as it was in his vault. Why are we splitting up? Helen Granger asked, once they had. Ron needs a wand, and his mum would go spare if she found out he broke it, Hermione summed up. It wasn't ever a good match for him anyway, so I'm expecting better performance in class, Ronald Bilious Weasley, she added. Ron nodded in acceptance. It was a hand-me-down from my brother, he explained to the Grangers. Helen and Jean shared a look. Wands were only the equivalent of £35. They hadn't realized the Weasleys couldn't afford new for their child's primary tool of magic. While Ron was being given the wand and pony show by Ollivander, Harry quietly caught Hermione up with what they'd learned in the past few days at the Weasleys. Well, I want to be a marauder too, she said. You know, it's probably a club about playing pranks, right? Harry checked. She huffed, not wanting to be left out, even if she didn't really care for the subject matter still. Okay, you're invited to join the Marauders. I accept, she nodded. Hermione Granger has joined the Marauders, there you go. I don't know what a guild is good for other than letting me know who all is in it, Harry informed her. That's still useful information. We should find out more information about your father's friends. If they're inactive and not deceased, that must mean they're still around. They probably could tell you stories, she figured. Harry nodded, appreciating the idea. Ron showed up beaming, still unicorn hair, but longer and willow instead of ash. He showed them his new wand. Does it feel different? Harry checked. It's brilliant, Ron agreed. I never really felt like Charlie's old wand liked me. Unicorn hair is very loyal to its original owner, Mr. Ollivander said, appearing suddenly behind them. I have tried to tell the older families that passing down wands is economical but not ideal. Your change. He handed Ron a few nuts and showed them out of the shop. Helen Granger suggested, before Hermione could stomp straight to the bookstore, why don't we get the rest of your school supplies? We may never get around to it otherwise. Yes, Mum, Hermione agreed sadly. There was already a line forming outside Flourish and Blart's down the street. She'd probably not get to spend as much time in there as she'd hoped after all. Chapter 12. Duel. Well, that was a disaster, George complained, slumping into the ratty couch they'd acquired somehow for the hideout under the orchard. What even happened? Fred agreed, unshrinking a few other pieces of fourth-hand furniture they'd got to make it a real clubhouse. We missed most of it. Lockhart and then the Malfoys, Ron growled, joining George on the couch. Pompous gits, all of them. Lockhart dragged Harry up front to get his picture in the paper. He said together we rate the front page, Harry complained, perching on the couch's deteriorating armrest. He practically dragged me out of the crowd as soon as he saw me. He paused and said, He's our new defense professor, by the way. Ron continued the story. Then as soon as we got out of that, Malfoy showed up to insult Harry about loving having his picture taken. Ginny stuck her nose in. Malfoy made a crack about her being Harry's girlfriend, and that made it all worse. I didn't even get a chance to ask if he had a girlfriend. Harry shook his head. It worked on my cousin. He hadn't had the chance because Ron had joined in, and that gave Draco an avenue for moving on to insulting Ron about being poor. Well, then our dads got involved. Mr. Malfoy insulted us, and it got to a fistfight that Hagrid had to break up. Ron finished. We didn't even get to check any books to see if they were skill books, Harry sighed. Barely got out with our school books. Classic Weasley family outing, George joked. Did you at least get a wand? Fred checked. Yeah, Ron smiled, showing off his new and improved wand. Works much better. So Lockhart's the professor, huh? George asked. Fred said, bet he's like a level 20 monster slayer gardener the way Mum talks. Harry shook his head. He's only level 8, mage entertainer class. Isn't even up to a hybrid class. And his only guild other than being Hogwarts staff is that he was in Ravenclaw. Guess he looks pretty young, but that seems low. I think he might just be a writer, you know. We should probably figure his books are just fiction. Better tell Hermione that, Ron suggested. Practically had little hearts in her eyes for him. He is a pretty man, Fred agreed. Find out anything else interesting? George asked. Hagrid's level 16 and also in the Order, Harry said. He explained that it was a group Dumbledore ran to fight Death Eaters, which Lucius Malfoy definitely is. He's level 12, I think. Mum fought Death Eaters, Ron boggled. You've never seen Mum use her wand for more than household charms, George smirked. She's fierce. I can bet she'd be a terror if it wasn't just us she was casting at. And I think that's how her brothers died, Fred remembered. Vigilante work in the war, but all the Prewetts were involved. Even Aunt Muriel, Ron checked. Probably not Aunt Muriel, Fred allowed. Oh, right, George said. Do you have the stuff? Yeah, Harry said. He opened his inventory and started taking out all the prank items that Fred and George had slipped him before Mrs. Weasley checked their pockets on the way home. I need more storage. You should have gotten a trunk or bag with undetectable extension, George said. We get one, but they're pricey. We're trying to work out how to enchant them ourselves. Then we wouldn't need you to smuggle stuff. I didn't even know that was an option, Harry grumbled. It's bigger on the inside. They nodded. I wonder if I can mail order one. That sounds dead useful. Ron had been thinking and asked, We've got 2 weeks until school. What are we going to do? Study, Fred suggested, and then laughed at his own joke. Finish setting up the hideout, George said, finally getting off the couch to go help his brother arrange furniture. Did you have something in mind? Harry asked. Well, you said you were getting rewards and experience from just doing stuff around town, right? Ron asked. Harry nodded. What if we went looking around town for more quests? We could earn more pocket money, even if it's muggle money, and maybe we'd get something useful. Will your mum let us? Harry checked. As long as nobody calls the Auras, she doesn't mind us going into town, Fred shrugged. George explained, We've taught her it's safer than if we're being quiet at home. Then I'm okay with it, Harry agreed. But I do want to do some studying, or at least get you two to help us practice spells. My combat magic is still not, and I don't like it. Are you suggesting you want to duel? Fred asked. We've actually got the space for it, George agreed, eyeing the room as a dueling arena. And since in an instance we can cast spells without getting in trouble, Fred figured. Harry Potter, George spun, drawing his wand and raising it to guard position. I challenge you to a duel. Accept duel. Whoa, that triggered something from the game, Harry explained, drawing his own wand and matching George's stance. Okay, I accept. Friendly duel, temporary consequences. Well, that sounds helpful, Harry said, then explained. It says since this is a friendly duel, any consequences are temporary. Does that mean we can go all out? George beamed. I've got next, Fred announced, producing an old glove from somewhere and lightly swishing it across Ron's face. Harry tried, but I don't know much. Expelliarmus. George yelled, and Harry barely dodged the spell he didn't know. Rictus Sempra, Immobilis. To everyone except Harry's delight, the spells he was dodging evaporated before hitting the walls or furniture, just like in a real warded dueling space. Harry barely noticed, as frantically as he was diving out of the way. He didn't even have time to get his own spell off before Fred finally landed a jinx that stuck him to the floor and then managed to disarm him. Duel complete sure enough, as soon as he lost, his feet came unstuck. Can we go a little slower next time? Harry asked. We'll see, George shrugged. Fred grinned as he announced, Ron, we're up. They amused themselves the rest of the day dueling, and despite constantly being trounced by the twins, Ron and Harry were learning a lot. He finally got that elusive first rank of owl combat magic, and was beginning to pick up a few of the more difficult spells the older boys were using. Through frequent time diving to the floor, he'd also picked up 2 ranks in a new basic dodging skill. With his enhanced agility, even in the smallish room it was starting to get hard for the twins to land spells on him without having to work hard for it. On Thursday, they finally tried out Ron's plan, venturing into Ottery St. Catchable. The ancient village was, in the modern day, pretty much just a bedroom community for Exeter. At least by virtue of being nearly as old as Hogwarts, the buildings were a much more interesting setup than Little Winging, for all that the town didn't have any more amenities. Pretty much all it really had going for it was the nearby giant old church, and a whimsical road network that flowed and walled like river branches, rather than adhering to any sort of grid system. It only took a few days for the locals to start to notice that there was a gang of adolescents, mostly red-headed, who seemed to have shown up to their quiet hamlet to do good deeds and be helpful, which was a pretty strange occurrence with the youth of the 1990s. It was also pretty clear that they were not the wealthiest bunch. At least Harry had vetoed a few of the more insane thrift store clothes they thought were muggle-appropriate. Eventually, the gossips of the town uncovered that they were locals that didn't come into the village much and were trying to entertain their cousin Harry for the summer. Ron was right. The quest rewards were small but decent. Since being fed wasn't a problem with Mrs. Weasley cooking, they weren't getting fast food meals the way Harry had been, but had picked up quite a few nice cuts of meat from the butcher and vegetables from various locals that Marley had used to make delicious lunches. And she was only getting slightly suspicious about how they were doing odd jobs around town and getting paid in ingredients. They'd racked up a fair handful of muggle money, and the twins had discovered that miscellaneous tools and herbs from the home and gardening supply stores would substitute just as well as wizarding supplies for a lot of their crafting plans. They'd also all rounded out their muggle wardrobes, which was always a help for growing boys used to hand-me-downs. Perhaps their biggest prize was for a quest they'd done for the local cobbler, who made them all extremely comfortable walking shoes due to all the wandering around town they'd been doing. Harry's discovery of the map had made it even easier to find quests, since he could see the exclamation point markers on his map much further across town than he could with just his normal vision. It let him find people that needed help inside of buildings and even on nearby streets. There was one quest marker that was always just at the edge of his map as they walked on the lane past the church, and finally Harry decided he had to check it out the Sunday before they were to head back to Hogwarts. I'm not even sure how we get to it. It looks deep in the church, he explained, but I think they'll probably just let us go in if we attend service. Fortunately, their new clothing included button-downs and slacks dressy enough for Sunday best. Somehow 3 redheads that had never given a moment of consideration to Muggle religion, and a boy who'd actively been kept from any kind of social event by his guardians, made it through the service without embarrassing themselves. Mostly, they just knelt when other people did, glanced at what others were doing with their hymnals, and tried to bow their heads when everyone else did. Marley Weasley would have been very surprised how non-disruptive her boys could be when their objective was stealth. They'd possibly be back later, now that they realized what a giant venue for pranking there was so close to their house. As the service was concluding and everyone was getting up and conversing, the boys managed to dodge interested parishioners, several of whom recognized them as the helpful lads from the village the last week or two, and make for the quest marker in the southern edge of the vast room of ancient stonework. The whole place really reminded them a lot of Hogwarts. The quest marker was sitting right at a large square clock. The blue-backed device had a sun, moon, and star that seemed designed to travel around 3 concentric, numbered rings. But it wasn't moving, or was moving so slowly they couldn't tell. You're checking out the astronomical clock, I see, one of the junior priests said, walking over. Michael Coley, Reverend, Level 10, Church of England. As he got closer, the yellow exclamation mark appeared over his head, and Harry gave the nod toward him that they'd practiced all week for him to indicate quest givers. Reverend Coley continued, "It's one of the first ever mechanical clocks, built in the 1300s. Is it broken, sir?" Harry asked. "Well," the man frowned, "it's been having its issues, missing a few parts, and they were handmade, so they're a bit difficult to replace." "We could try to find the parts," Ron suggested, catching on. "Who took them?" "No one believes me," the man sighed. They looked at him, waiting until he admitted, "I think it was the Pixies." The boys didn't laugh. They just looked at one another and nodded. That seemed totally reasonable. "Do you know which way they went?" Harry checked. "Well, we have the Pixie Day in June, where we pretend reenact chasing the pixies off to the hills like at the founding of the church," Michael explained. "And this year I swore I saw a few tiny blue men fluttering about. They hid in the clock because they blended in, you see. I must sound mad. Could have been some kind of big bug, sir. But we'll find them," Harry agreed. "You think they went off toward the hills?" "Honestly, I think they may still be nesting in the building. I swear I've seen them out of the corner of my eye from time to time all summer," he shrugged. Pesky Pixie Paternoster retrieve the clock mechanism pieces, 03, and drive off the pixies, 09. "We're on it, Reverend," Harry nodded, leading the boys off so he could relay the quest text to them. He also explained, "There are some yellow circles on the map around the church. Maybe we should look in those areas." "Makes sense. It's funny, that quest name almost sounds like spell we found for dealing with pixies," Fred explained. "Doesn't work, though," George said. "And out to be a joke spell. You can just use Immobulus, though. Learned that from a defense teacher that was worth anything," Ron asked. "Nah," Fred said. "Just caught some pixies our second year to use in a prank." George grinned. That was part of how we got the detention that led to us finding the map in Filch's office. With their good deeds around town and Reverend Coley's permission, nobody said too much about the four boys wandering around the church, poking into back rooms and balconies. It only took them about half an hour to find all 9 pixies, conveniently in nests of 3, each with a shiny piece of the clock pushed away along with some muggle and wizarding money. And with Harry's instancing, they could quickly handle the pests by magically immobilizing them. "Worse than nifflers, I swear," George complained as they retrieved the last piece. "Think we can treat 9 stunned pixies as a bonus quest reward?" Fred grinned, having ideas. "Here are your pieces, Reverend," Harry said, handing the 3 pieces of clockwork to Michael. "Oh, my word, thank you so much," the priest exclaimed. "I've been hearing such good things about you boys. Hope to see you around more often." "Well, we're going back to school this week, but maybe next summer," Ron shrugged, and all 4 boys looked expectantly at the priest. "Well, so you don't forget us, let me get you each a rosary," he suggested, coming back with 4 beaded wooden necklaces. "Quest complete 50 XP earned quest reward. Blessed rosary, thank you, so see you around," Harry said, inspecting his rosary as they left. He explained to everyone else, "It says that these make it easier to meditate and concentrate if you hold on to them, and that they might ward off dark creatures. Plus, we each got like a galleon and a half from the nests," Fred said, enthusiastically. "I'm almost sad to be going back to school," George agreed. "This has been a very productive summer." "Just think of the quests we'll be able to find at Hogwarts," Ron suggested. They all nodded, thoughtfully. It might turn out to be a really lucrative year.